Well, hello, everybody. It's David Leese here on Thursday, March the 13th. I hope you're having a great day. And today we're going to be talking about a lot of things, including who is our new prime minister? Well, almost, as he is going to be sworn in tomorrow on Friday. Who is Mark Carney? What does Mark Carney represent in terms of public policy on the record? And how can we thoughtfully reflect on that change of leadership? What does that mean for our country during this time where we are seeing all kinds of challenges from the United States and elsewhere within our country? And um, this is a historic time. Anyone would agree to that, where we have to decide, well, what are we going to do as a country to respond to these different challenges? We have different comments already. So, good afternoon, Prairie. We have Mark Wren saying Carney is a USA Democrat plant into our elections. And so that's part of, a lot of different comments coming in, and we welcome those comments. We really do appreciate it. And I want to give a little bit of a shout out, not only to our regular audience, but people that are joining us for this live format. It's been so heartwarming to hear people's concern and care for our country as people seek the truth, the facts, the evidence to understand how we can be best active as citizens in our country and to renew it and rebuild it. Um, and I want to tell you about an interesting conversation this past week. I was happened to be on relating to a person based in Canada who was on one of these telephone call centers. And one thing led to the next. And I was talking with this person, I'll call her Michelle, and it was amazing how much she was thinking as a Canadian, wondering, where do I get good information? And so I told her about this. And so she was really quite excited and saying, wow, I'm so grateful that there are people like yourself, David, that are working with teams of other people, other citizens from Canada who care enough for our country to try to look at these issues. So that's what we try to do. And we really do appreciate we love hearing from you. So bring it on. So we've got a lot to cover today. We've got two very special guests. We're going to get to that in a moment. I'm going to talk briefly about the headlines. And I wanted to just underline that we want to talk about Mark Carney as the prime minister elect, so to speak, as we reflect about who is Mark Carney. What are your observations and thoughts as an audience? But we want to talk also about the context that his term of office begins, namely the challenges around the United States and as they restructure, as they go through challenges, how do we best understand that? Um, and that's right, Colleen McFarland. She says, good afternoon. I believe it's important to know thy enemy. Exactly. So, who is the enemy? Is it ourselves or is it the United States? Both. It's confusing. Sometimes we use the word frenemy. In some cases, we can work with parties and work with them effectively, like the United States. But remember this, I think various statesmen have said through the years that remember, countries always have their interests. So, how is the United States pursuing its interests, and how best, given that knowledge, should we be managing this situation? So that's part of what we'll be looking at. We'll also be talking briefly about some of the security concerns as well around this issue. There's a lot of fascinating things in the news that we'll be sharing with you today, as well as the great nation of Mexico and talking about them in terms of a bit of a contrast in terms of how Mexico is working with the United States than perhaps Canada. But we'll get to that in a moment. One of the breaking news items that just unfolded a few hours ago is we understand that Vladimir Putin has backs a U.S. ceasefire proposal for the Ukraine. So that terrible war has taken some 800,000 lives, I understand. It's been a terrible war, and there's efforts to try to bring that to a conclusion. So we'll have to see how that unfolds. We also know that Mark Carney apparently is going to be visiting Europe next week. That will be his first unofficial trips as the Prime Minister to London and Paris as he's sworn in tomorrow. We also know that there's a number of other items in the news. It's a little bit hard to track all of these tariff punches, if you want to call them that, but Canada has punched back a counterpunch of $30 billion, and apparently that's in the works now to respond to the United States set of tariffs. So we go back and forth, and some have been withdrawn. I believe that Premier Doug Ford in Ontario threatened a 25% increase on electricity exports, but that was promptly withdrawn after the Trump administration hit back with its own counterpunch. So this war is kind of unfolding, and it's kind of disturbing as it creates uncertainty regarding the status of U.S. levies because business needs certainty, just as we need certainty in our lives. We noticed that the Bank of Canada cut interest rates the other day to 2.75% or reduced it by 0.25% or 25 basis points. We also have different provinces undertaking actions. We notice that various provinces, I believe in Manitoba, BC included, have removed all US liquor from their shelves. And on top of that, we've got a lot of other interesting cases. I don't know if you noticed this, but there is a fascinating case in Ontario where a judge has slammed his colleagues for damaging the quote institutional credibility of the court system after they gave no prison time to a gunman at an infamous Toronto funeral shooting. Quote, if an offender can bring a handgun to a funeral, fire it towards the busiest highway in the country, ultimately avoiding incarceration, then it is evident that this court's warnings about handgun violence have been rendered futile. So said or wrote Ontario Appeals Court Justice William Horrigan in a dissent regarding the case of Terrell Burke Whitaker. What a statement. So, what do you think about that? So, the world continues to unfold, and I would like to now introduce our special guests. I am delighted to welcome back to the program Scott McGregor, who's a security analyst, and he has worked both with the RCMP and the armed forces. I know that, Scott, we've had some terrific conversations trying to understand and peel back the issues related to security in our own country, as that's certainly one of the concerns. So, a warm welcome to you, Scott.
Thank you for having me.
And I also want to welcome the Vice President of Research and Policy, Dr. Marco Navarro-Genie. And a warm welcome to you, Marco, as we peel the onion on what's unfolding today. So, welcome, Marco.
Thank you. Good afternoon.
Well, look, gentlemen, I am very excited about our conversation today because right off the top, it's official that Mark Carney got the crown of the Liberal leadership to head up his party. He was elected by a number of people, and I guess my first question is, were you surprised that Mark Carney won the race? I mean, I know that there were a number of other contenders, including former Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland and some others. Were you surprised by the results, Marco?
I was not. I would venture a guess that not many people were surprised. But the big surprise to me was the magnitude of the victory, which casts, some people have pointed out, some suspicion considering that 86% of people voted for Carney, which in and of itself is not a bad thing. It's just the uniformity and the consistency with which people across the country, from one end to the other, voted in such mass numbers for essentially an unknown guy, leaving behind people like Chrystia Freeland, who had been quite prominent, the deputy prime minister of the previous government, and so forth. So the fact that Ms. Freeland didn't even win in her own riding, she got completely massacred. What is also surprising, of course, is that Carney is a banker. He's a white man, and this is the party of diversity and all sorts of woke things that left women and people of color out. So I find that surprising.
Yeah, no, it is kind of ironic in that sense, isn't it? Were you surprised by the scale of victory then? Like the percentages were, I believe, almost 85% in favor of Mark Carney.
85.9%, so 86% effectively, with only about 8% for Miss Freeland, and then much lesser numbers for the other two candidates. That was not really a surprise, but that Chrystia Freeland would receive such paltry support from this party, the party that she has been the deputy prime minister for, that was quite a surprise.
And it is interesting as well. Like I am familiar with a number of these ridings across the country, including Christopher Freeland's own constituency of centered on Rosedale in downtown Toronto. It's certainly
Right.
a very, very well-heeled riding. I was surprised that her support was so low, that her, even there, Mark Carney seemed to sweep every constituency. In fact, I think without exception, if memory serves me correctly.
I looked at the numbers fairly quickly, but there was not a single writing in the country that I could see, and I looked at preliminary numbers, so they may have changed, but they couldn't have changed because the differences were so dramatic. So in many writings, the victory of Carney over Freeland, over all the other ones, but we're talking about Freeland specifically, was in a magnitude, in one magnitude of numbers, and sometimes two. Which is unbelievable. In some places, Carney would have 1,000 votes, and Freeland would have a dozen, sometimes less than a dozen. That was that's one thing. The what is suspicious anyway is that statistically that's quite difficult to achieve. That
Mhm.
she would lose in every single constituency across the country with such large differences. So if we were talking about Rosedale, for example, and she had lost by 2 votes, for example,
Mhm.
that would seem not so odd that the Freeland camp put up a fight. But considering the gaps and the differences between the Carney numbers and everybody else's, including Freeland, uh, people talked about a coronation, and they were sort of jokingly, facetiously speaking about a coronation, but that's what it seems to have been, right? So he wins 86%. That means that 14%, the remainder, is divided among three different candidates.
Mhm.
Now, the other issue, of course, is that they counted 150,000 votes, more or less 151,000 votes, and that they discarded almost twice that number. That also makes it
Discarded.
quite
Discarded them.
discarded in the sense that they had 450, or they boasted to have had over 400,000, 450,000 registered members to vote, and that they were only able to verify so that they could vote about 151,000. So when I say discarded, it means that they either discarded them specifically, or they did not count them. They could not verify the identities, or
Mhm.
so forth. In light of the fact that we know that there was some serious shenanigans with, including foreign forces meddling with their processes before, it makes you wonder. Now they're not saying who, and they're not saying by what criteria exactly they excluded those nearly 300,000 other emails, voters, personas, I don't know what to call them.
Mhm.
But the fact is that only a small portion, about a third of those who presumably should have or could have voted, were allowed and counted.
No, it's fascinating. I notice we've got a number of comments from our kind audience here. Cheryl says, "Wow, sounds a little fishy." Exactly. So, I mean, votes matter, don't they, in terms of not just larger elections, but the integrity of party elections. And I know that there's been, frankly, questions raised about who can vote for a party leader, where you don't even necessarily need to be a citizen. How bizarre is that? Um, And this is important. I mean, it begs the question around building trust in our institutions, and that includes political parties. Is that a legitimate, a fair question, Marco? In this case,
Sure,
you're a political scientist.
it does look fishy. Look, on a regular election, there is a 2-3% of votes that are sort of selected out because there's issues with them. They've been mismarked or whatever. A very tiny percentage. When the comment of the viewer that it is fishy for many reasons. But here's the principal reason why it is fishy. Normally, if you select out 2 or 3% of the possible votes out of the picture, then that doesn't have an impact on the overall vote. But when the votes that were sort of uh, where the number of people not allowed to vote or selected out is almost twice as large as the number of the voters who voted for the winner, makes you wonder what happened, right? What if only half of those votes that were not allowed into the count were for one candidate alone? That means that somebody else would have won. So that casts a light, not just a suspicion, but even if one is not naturally suspicious, statistically, these things seemed quite peculiar, if not altogether strange.
Exactly. Well, I certainly appreciate your recap on that, Marco, and these are certainly important questions that we need to be aware of. It's interesting. We've got a lot of comments. Estelle says, uh, thank you. We also need to recount. So thank you for your comments, Estelle. And also, pardon my pronunciation, Bobcat Y. He is definitely a globalist elite who is not for ordinary Canadians. So that's a kind of a take on Mark Carney. Interesting. Billy says 40 million people, and our prime minister was selected by 150,000 people. That's wrong on so many levels. So, how about that? So we're within a part. Boy, these comments keep rolling in here. I'll just go to Frank here. You are doing a great job educating Canadians. Keep it up. We need to break through the CBC garbage and get the truth out there. Well, by golly, let's get through the truth. And thank you very much, Mark. And I believe Foam Fatel said another kind comment. So thank you for that comment. And Joss says, Mark Carney, just another corrupt banker. Wow. Well, we're not sure necessarily about corruption, but I guess corruption means different things. It could be meaning um, certainly on the take, that's a form of corruption, but perhaps corruption from an intellectual point of view as we talk about policies here. So, Marco, thank you for your summary of the dynamics and questions regarding the election. And I want to come back to who Mark Carney represents in terms of policy here, because I think that's a very important topic. But I want to go back to you, Scott McGregor, because Scott, we've talked a lot about the context that Mark Carney's coming into now relative to our trade um disputes with the United States. And it's interesting, the response to our previous conversations from an audience point of view has been really quite um, favorable in the sense that there's been a large response of comments and interest in our discussions. I think that the audience has been quite large because I think you have helped us see perhaps a bigger picture of how the United States is really critiquing a country, namely Canada, about a number of issues that perhaps we don't see. And those relate to security. And I think you're the author, I'll bring it up here, the with Madam Producer here's help, the book that you wrote, The Mosaic Effect, you co-authored that, how the Chinese Communist Party started a hybrid war in America's backyard, namely Canada. And I thought the response has been really quite huge to your thesis that we've got to pay attention to security issues in Canada that have been around for years, but we just don't hear about them as Canadians. And the Americans see this. And I guess the question is there's been a lot happening since our last several interviews. We even have two Black Hawk helicopters on patrol now up and down the border. And we've got the appointment of a fentanyl czar. Do you think it's changing? Do you think Canadian leaders are responding seriously to these concerns by the United States? Because that's part and parcel of what's driving our disputes with the United States. What are your observations, Scott?
Well, thank you for the question. I think there's a lot going on. I think Canada is starting to realize what the Americans have been talking about for the last 30 years. Unfortunately, for many, they're not aware of the threats in Canada that are affecting the United States. As we move towards what we're terming continentalism, we're starting to see, the United States consolidate its power. It's starting to uh, actually take active measures to try to safeguard their nation. At the same time, they are trying to shake Canada and Mexico up a bit because nothing has been done in the past, 20 years, 30 years. The big shift in about 1997, there's a lot of talk about what was going on with, Chinese triads, et cetera, coming to Canada. But what we see is 9/11 happens and everything shifts to counterterrorism. So all of our institutions are moving towards that threat.
Mhm.
At the same time, we had the Aurora case, which caused a real problem in law enforcement because of disclosure. So that's been a bug in law enforcement ever since. Um, in regards to what Canada is doing, as our government is still it's making token efforts, in my opinion.
Mhm.
The Black Hawk
Mhm.
helicopters are leased from the United States. They don't carry any surveillance equipment, and they're marginalizing the RCMP's own helicopter capabilities on the border. So that's concerning. It doesn't really show you that they're achieving anything. We're not seeing any arrests or anyone going to jail here. Not like what we're seeing in Mexico, and not what we're seeing in the United States, for that matter. Um, you were speaking about Carney. I know a little bit about him. I'm not a political analyst by any means. However, I am aware of his connections to the CCP uh, through his business affiliations, and those things are concerning. I know a lot of people are paying attention to these in the intelligence world. Um, and the United States is not blind to these things. The United States knows exactly what's going on in our government. They know exactly who's connected to who and what they're doing. Um, to think otherwise is foolish. And so there's reasons behind the actions that the United States is taking. And I think Canadians, while getting poked in the chest, because of the comment about becoming the 51st state is offensive. Um, that stirred up a lot of patriotism, and that patriotism is misguided. And I think they've forgotten that the largest threat in the world is China, bar none.
Oh,
What's going on in Russia and
okay.
Ukraine does not compare at all. And that's what they're missing when they're trying to figure out what's going on with the United States and the actions they're taking.
Mhm. Okay, so you're giving us some reality therapy, as I call it, in the sense that let's be clear, the United States is going through a massive restructuring, both in terms of its economy, but also its geopolitical security situation. So they are looking at the hemisphere as you've outlined, and they're saying we want it to be a safe and secure hemisphere, and we want prosperity. We're not going to tolerate an ally, in quotes, who they would accuse Canada of being a NATO freeloader. Um, that allows infiltration with a lot of bad actors, including the CPC, within Canada, which is the United States backyard. So, am I oversimplifying that, Scott? Is that kind of how I mean, you relate to US officials all the time. Is that how they're seeing us?
Yes, the simple answer is yes. There is a lot going on in Canada um, beyond guns and gangs. And it's gone ignored by the government for a long, long time. We see token efforts when we identify the Iranian regime, the IRGC, Quds Force, Hezbollah being identified as terrorist entities, and we have the world's largest post-Shah Iranian diaspora living in North Vancouver,
Mhm,
where
mhm.
where Iranians are scared and worried about this activity, we're not reading about any arrests. We're not reading about any charges. And that's not necessarily the law enforcement's issue. It's political will. Because if you don't change legislation in the justice system to actually enable the police to be able to do something about it and make it a priority, then things aren't getting done. And the connection between, the Chinese, the Iranians, and the cartels is well established. You only have to look at the dirty money reports written from the Cullen Commission to understand the scope of that. I was happy to provide a lot of that information. But there are a lot of people working in law enforcement, intelligence, and security that understand the nature of the threat. We're talking about a complete saturation in Canada. Almost every single file a law enforcement officer looks at regarding narcotics, human smuggling, any of that stuff, that is transnational in nature and almost always leads back to a nation state. So it's state-sponsored illicit activity occurring all over Canada. So yeah, I would say
Okay.
we've got a problem here and the Americans are worried about it.
Okay, because honestly, I monitor our legacy media within obviously Canada, the United States, and even Chinese media, and you certainly don't hear about this story about Canada. And this is coming from you. You're an intelligence analyst, and certainly we're familiar with Scott. Really landmark intelligence reports that have been tabled with our own elected officials for years, citing these concerns, and yet we seem to be deaf to the point that we need action. We can't just kind of pretend or be like in theater here and be performative, but this needs to be action. We need to get to action. We need to deal with the money laundering, all these things. And I want to cite an interesting case that just came up, I believe, yesterday. And this has to do with a very interesting civil forfeiture case in Surrey in the lower mainland of British Columbia. The Simaloa drug cartel worked closely with three Surrey men in an attempt to smuggle large amounts of cocaine and other precursors for drugs from Mexico to Canada last year, the BC government is alleging. And so details of this operation were laid out in a civil forfeiture case filed Tuesday against these three men. And their home was chock full of weaponry, among other chemicals and issues. I mean, this is on top of many other similar cases, as well as a few weeks ago, the shutdown of certainly one of North America's largest fentanyl labs near Kelowna. And this apparently this lab, as it was described by officers, had serious scientific instrumentation and warehouses. This was not just simply in someone's shed in their backyard or something like this. So does that surprise you, Scott? These revelations that are now finally starting to, well, be public.
It doesn't. It surprises me that mainstream media has taken a look at it. There's been things that have been going on in the country for a long time. People have been trying to raise awareness about some of those things. There's barriers to that, especially in my world. Speaking directly to any specific entity can be dangerous. The lawfare is real. So these people have the best lawyers in Canada representing them. It's not something that you want to get involved in necessarily unless you have the money to fight defamation suits left, right, and center. In regards to what you're talking about with the Sinaloa, the Sinaloa has been controlling the I-5 corridor for a long time. That's well established within law enforcement. There's been open source reporting about this, so that information is available. But not only the Sinaloa, the CGNG, which is the largest, richest cartel in Mexico, they're also involved. And we see a lot of activity in Canada. El Chapo, one of El Chapo's headquarters was in Canada.
Pardon me? Can you repeat that?
Yeah, El Chapo had a headquarters in Canada. A lot of people think it was Chicago, and it wasn't. That's also open source. You can find that information publicly. But the connection between the cartels, the Iranians, and the Chinese is significant in the transnational organized crime world, specifically in threat finance. Vancouver is, well, it's the center of gravity for all that type of stuff. That's where you hear about the Vancouver model, et cetera. And that's just one model. There's many of them.
Mhm.
Trade-based and service-based money laundering are at a standard in the gray and black market that people just couldn't even comprehend. Every aspect of critical infrastructure is infiltrated. It's very, very rampant. And I imagine I'll get called out for this, which is fine because I have plenty of information to back it up.
Mhm.
But the worry for the United States is the fact that we're seeing all this political interference, and if decision makers can't change the legislation to enable law enforcement to affect this activity, then we're in deep trouble, and we have been for 30 something years. Um, so the Americans know that. That's what the premise for the book states, that there's a U.S. government document from the Department of Justice identifying Canada as a national security threat because of the Chinese infiltration uh, in its critical infrastructure, its private sector, et cetera, and how that impacts the United States. Um, all the arrests that you see of Canadian citizens of Chinese descent and others stemming from Canada, and yet in Canada we see none. We have so many cases, and I'm sure you're going to talk about some of them, but the connections to the United States are immense. The head of the RCMP Intelligence was arrested because of the Americans.
Pardon me. Can you repeat that?
The head of RCMP Intelligence, Cameron Ortis, was involved in some files that the RCMP had, but that they were working jointly with the United States. When it came to the data that came out of that investigation, it wasn't Canada that figured it all out. We didn't have the means to do that. So the Americans advised the Canadians on what was going on. We've seen this in terrorist incidents. We've seen this in a number of different locations.
Mhm.
And so when people get all upset at America over the tariff stuff and everything, I understand. I'm sympathetic to that. I'm open-minded. I'm not a Trump supporter or anything like that.
Mhm.
But they seem to forget very quickly all of the things that have been going on over the years, where the Americans have pointed these things out. How did they forget about what just happened with the TD Bank? I don't see anyone outside protesting the TD Bank, the largest
Mhm.
financial fine in history. One person gets arrested. Nobody in Canada does anything, and it's not even mainstream news. This is just one financial institution. I can guarantee you there's others. The RBC takeover HSBC, who also had a large fine for helping the cartels. Um, I don't know where people are forgetting what's going on in the country, but suddenly they're rallying behind this liberal initiative um, to unify the country, and the Chinese are loving it. Um, don't get me wrong. I think the manner in which some of this stuff with the tariffs has been approached is abrasive. I don't think that Canadians, um, respond well to that type of pressure uh, because we're Canadians. It's just the way we are. We don't, we get our feelings hurt pretty quickly and are quick
Mhm.
to want to fight, just like in hockey. But the fact of the matter is that this has been raised over the years numerous times at the highest levels, and absolutely nothing is being done. The
Mhm.
people, the police officers that are on the street have become way more aware than they ever have been, because a lot of this has come out now, from myself and others that have been trying to raise awareness about this. Um, but they're hamstrung. They
Mhm.
want to do
Okay.
the right thing, but they can't.
So this is the context. So this is where Mark Carney as the new leader's coming in. And what I find fascinating here is that we have established facts that indicate that a number of these concerns are real regarding security. And of course, we can have debates around the scale and scope, but we know that based on a lot of work within the intelligence community, including just as you outlined, Scott, that we need to be taking these concerns seriously. Now, there's other issues that have been raised by the Trump administration that you can argue are kind of negotiation tactics or are kind of confusing as to what's going on here. So I want to go back to you, Marco, because you are a brilliant analyst, you're a political scientist, and you look at the larger picture here. Help us understand the context that we as a nation, including our new prime minister, faces then. Like, what is going on here as the United States identifies not only these security issues, but this kind of hemispheric approach to, well, from Greenland to Panama, as they kind of reset and restructure. What's your observations? Help us understand what's going on here, the bigger context.
That's a very good question. And just going from your question and sort of linking back to what we were saying before, it would help to think, for example, of this hemisphere as a condominium. Imagine there's this condominium in which there are over 25 different units. And in the north wing of the condominium, there are three big penthouses. The other sort of smaller units are, in the south wing. And the northernmost member of the condominium, who is also responsible or just as responsible as everybody else for the safety and for the security of the entire building, keeps leaving the doors open. And there are burglars and there are arsonists and there are criminals coming in and out. The northernmost condominium owner has been 3 or 4 times leaving the bath water running and flooding the rest of the condominium. There's been fires in that particular unit repeatedly that puts in danger the entire, not just the north wing of the condominium, but the entire building. And so all of a sudden, right, the most immediate neighbor to the northernmost condominium owner comes up and says, you know what? This enough is enough, right? We've been carrying this. We've had all these accidents. You keep leaving the door open. There's all this criminality. There's all this vandalism. There's all these things. We want you to look after and police your own thing and don't leave the faucets open and stop the appliances going on fire and all these things, or else we are going to put this gigantic fine on your ownership in the condominium, or we're going to kick you out of the condominium. And this is exactly what is going on. We like to think that Canadians are nice, and we are, generally speaking. But the fact is that for the last 40 years, this is not just a Trudeau problem. We have been a neglectful condominium owner. We have been a very bad neighbor in so many different things. And so now that our neighbor is calling us on it, we get all indignant like a child, like a teenager who gets called on for, leaving the dirty dishes in the sink. And now we're crying foul and we're blaming the person who is calling us out for all the neglect. This is Canada. And so our government is pulling a tantrum, just like they did in COVID, by the way. They would rather have a tantrum and make a big crisis out of it, because the alternative was to admit that they had essentially botched the health issue. And they continue to do it, by the way, right? Because our hospitals are in shambles, our health system is crumbling. That is the real issue and should have been the real issue in COVID. Here is we're blaming Trump, we're blaming the Americans, we're blaming everybody and their grandmother so that the governments do not, and governments in plural, because there have been, as I said, many, rather than accept responsibility for their neglect over these last few decades, we're trying to blame Trump. And Trump is an easy target because of his style and whatnot. We are also tapping, by the way, in what is essentially a very nasty streak of anti-Americanism in the culture. And so, again, we are trying to hide being bad neighbors by being even worse neighbors.
Oh my gosh, what a summary from Scott McGregor and Marco Navarro-Genie, from security issues to are we bad neighbors within this condominium analogy. I think that's a brilliant analysis. So, audience, what do you think of that? We've got a whole range of comments. Prairie says, not a peep from mainstream media in Canada about the TD Bank scenario. I think that's been largely true. Um, and other comments, Sherry asks a very good question. So, how do we take them down? I think you're referring to the cartels. And how do we get our country back without the cops and the justice system is afraid to go after them? We need a corporation like the FBI in Canada. Well, that's a really good question. Scott, any immediate response to Sherry's question?
Sherry, I like your question. You're going to hate the answer. Unfortunately, uh, all of the agencies, CSIS, RCMP, CBSA, are all sub-ministries under the Ministry of Public Safety. That makes them all political entities. So what the government wants is what they will do. And to take that a little bit further is our justice system isn't designed to enable the type of activity that law enforcement needs to take to stop this stuff. I don't disagree with you. The RCMP should be federal and leave the rest to everyone else. They were founded on a two-man team that would go and patrol small towns in rural Canada. And so when you have people that are posted from northern Manitoba into the city of Vancouver to run things, they're completely out of their element. And by the time they get caught up, unfortunately, they're getting promoted and moved to another position. So that stuff doesn't really get the attention it needs. The other side of that is in Canada, information sharing at the classified level between agencies does not really happen. Unlike the United States, in 2011, President Obama made transnational organized crime a national security threat, which enabled them to share information between different agencies, including the military. Most classified information in Canada is with the military. So they know a lot about what's going on and can't talk to the law enforcement agencies about it. Part of my role while I was there was trying to fix this, but we were shut down by Ottawa. Some of it had to do with Mr. Cameron Ortis and what he was up to. And so all that type of activity doesn't occur really in Canada. So to answer your question, using the Five Eyes, that's the Five Eyes Intelligence, so Australia, Canada, Great Britain, and UK, and New Zealand, that's how we would approach this. And unfortunately, what you're seeing right now is the people that provide most of that type of information, the United States of America, isn't happy with what we're doing with the information. And we are not helping ourselves by not being, the government not enabling and making some changes legislatively to be able to achieve those goals. We're not even identifying them right now. We have a liberal government that is suddenly nationalist, and this chaos works for them. This is all political. Everything that you're seeing in the media coming from the liberals right now is political. It has nothing to do with actually achieving any economic goals or anything else. Is Trump trying to position himself to negotiate? Sure. But the real thing is that people are missing. The United States is afraid. Let me say that again. They are afraid. So when people are afraid, they want safety and security. So they're consolidating power in North America to protect what they have, while everything that's going on in the world is starting to become out of their control. Europe has its own issues. Europe is its own continent. So it should have its own continental security and not rely on the United States for that. Don't get me wrong. I think we need to be allies, and I think we need to work together against authoritarian governments and the alliances that they're making, because this challenge is real, and now they're about to do something. Other governments were trying to negotiate their way out of it, and they were unable to. So now you've got a hard negotiator who's going to flex the American power while they still have it. That's
Okay.
my opinion.
Yeah,
I'm just saying,
exactly.
but
And you've got the midterms, so there's a narrow window, so they're going to go out at full throttle, and they are not. They're going to consolidate, the security of the United States. There's a lot of comments coming in, And I so much appreciate the audience comments here as we talk with Scott McGregor, security analyst, and Dr. Marco Navarro-Genie about the politics of this situation as we talk about a new leader of the Liberal Party and our Prime Minister now coming in to be sworn in tomorrow. So um, before I turn back to you, Marco, I just want to play a clip from certainly a very powerful leader within the Trump administration on his take about Canada's fentanyl issues.
Core fairness issues. Let's just be fair. Whatever you do to us, we'll do to you. That's what he's asking for in April, and it's not a radical idea at all.
But let me ask, because I am confused now about what you're saying about this being a drug war, not a trade war. So let's just take Canada. Mm-hmm. I mean, you said Canada's shipping fentanyl into the United States. I mean, I don't think that's happening. Sure. I mean, 1% of fentanyl is being smuggled across the border. 1%. I mean, Canada's not a major source at all of fentanyl in the United States, are they?
Well, yes, they are a major source. And I can tell you that in the Situation Room, I've seen photographs of fentanyl labs in Canada that the law enforcement folks were leaving alone. Canada's got a big drug problem, even in their own cities. Go walk around, Toronto and see what it's like. And you'll see that it is a big problem. And frankly, we have intelligence that Mexican cartels operate in Canada as well. And so if you want to get the cartels out of the U.S., you got to get them out of Canada and Mexico.
So there's the great Kevin Hassett. So I mean, you've got to listen to what they're saying. He also references being in the Situation Room, and this is what we don't have in Canada that I'm aware of, Scott. Is we don't have a Situation Room where all that information is on the table because we're designed to have information siloed. And so this is the situation. So as we approach this now, we have a new leader named Mark Carney, and it's interesting, Marco, as he accepted the mantle of leadership with the Liberal Party and ultimately being the prime minister, and he was anointed, as you said. He's a person with 3 passports. He has kind of laid down the gauntlet with the United States. His messaging, I thought, was fascinating. It was one of pursuing a trade war with the United States. And I can see how he's tapping into how so many Canadians are, rightly upset about, being questioned as a nation. But Marco, were you surprised by Mark Carney's messaging as he accepted the leadership of the Liberal Party?
Not at all. Carney is kind of tied up in a sense because in order to do what he needs to do to correct the things that need to be corrected, he would have to repudiate the current parliament. And that includes most of his colleagues in his party. These are the people from which tomorrow he's going to be naming people to sit around the cabinet. And so a great deal of the problems that we have that are self-inflicted by and large can be corrected, to be sure. But because they have been largely self-inflicted and in great measure in the last 10 years, he is the heir of the people who have either started some of these problems or magnified some of these problems. And so I was not surprised one bit that his rhetoric essentially mirrored the rhetoric of Prime Minister Trudeau.
So in that context, then, Marco, are you saying that as a political leader, he's inherited a legacy of 10 years of a Trudeau administration that has pursued, objectively a lot of policies that have not served Canada well, like with our lower standard of living, security issues to boot, all kinds of things. He's kind of he's kind of within that political box, if you will, that policy box. Is that what you're getting at?
Yes, and it's actually a little worse than that. And it's a little worse than that because we are essentially on the threshold of a federal election. And so what Carney would have to say to reverse course essentially would end up sounding like the leader of the opposition criticizing the Trudeau government, which he cannot do because his political fortunes are at play. And so Carney is essentially boxed into having to defend the record of the Trudeau government, even though he has been busy trying to distance himself from it.
Ah, okay. So if you were an advisor to Mark Carney, um, what would you advise him to do?
If I was an advisor to Mike Carney, I will tell him to leave politics and go find something else to do.
Okay.
Because the reality is, I don't. Mark Carney is essentially the 21st version, the 21st century version of John Turner, who inherited a gigantic mess from 16 years of Trudeau 1.0, and could not turn the fortunes of the party around, come what might, precisely because it was such a mess. Um, there are polls, I see them, that are claiming that he's gaining. I'm not surprised about that, considering that a large measure of the rejection of the Liberal Party was a rejection of the leader. But the reality is, I don't see how Mr. Carney could possibly cut away from the heritage and what he has inherited in this party. He's about to name Chrystia Freeland. He must, to some extent, to some sort of cabinet position. Marco Mendicino, the guy who wanted to throw tanks at the truckers in Ottawa, is now his chief of staff. Let us not forget that Mr. Carney penned an op-ed in a national newspaper calling the truckers, the protesters, the peaceful protesters, may I ask, seditionists. And he exaggerated their role and said that they were calling for the overthrow of the political system, which is of course nonsense. It's completely absurd. So the reality is he's boxed in, and I don't see him changing the discourse. He's going to change the words. He's only going to have a carbon tax for these people, but not for these people. And so he's going to try to spin things around. But I would be very surprised if he completely reversed course, because he would essentially be embracing the discourse and the platform of the official opposition.
Okay, so Mark, I'll begin with you as well, in the sense that I know that you've certainly observed Mark Carney for years here. Who is he? Like, we know that he served in key posts as the banker of the governor of Canada, as well as a similar position in England. He's really been involved in a lot of major international leadership positions, including, I think, leading a lot of work on environmental policy. So help us understand who Mark Carney is from a policy point of view.
From the outside, it's easy to see that Mark Carney is a banker, and he is well versed in some economic issues. Whether he has been right about those economic issues or not, the jury's still out. There's lots and lots of evidence that he has made all kinds of moves that are completely wrong, both in Canada and in England. The extent to which he was involved in some of the right moves in Canada, he has moved to sort of take full credit for all of it, where in fact he was part of a team, and the people making the actual calls were the elected, and that would have been the head of the government at the time, and the finance minister. And he was none of those. I have just been inside the mind of Mark Carney for the last couple of days, reading his book Values, and the polite way to say it is that he is a radical environmentalist. He is Greta Thunberg in a pinstripe banker's suit.
Okay.
He radically rejects market economies. He embraces a kind of a top-down authoritarian kind of green government that is going to tell us what to do and when to do it. He's convinced himself that we are in a in an era of doom that the planet is coming to an end unless we reverse course. And his rejection of the market is kind of peculiar because he doesn't like the market, which essentially means that he doesn't like human nature. But he's willing to put all kinds of constraints and take over the market. This is the authoritarian aspect of him, and take over the market and use the market for his ideological purposes, right? And so, considering that this is the environment, and the environment is all around us, whoever wants to control the environment will control our lives. And he wants to control the economy in order to control the environment because he's put it in very simple terms. He said that the way to stabilize the climate is to have more carbon taxes. So he's made a clear connection between people paying more taxes and the weather improving, essentially, as silly as that sounds. And so this is a guy who is essentially, I think, toning down his radical green agenda. But Canadians have rejected people like this before. Let's remember that Stéphane Dion had exactly the same plan, the famous green, infamous now, I suppose, green shift. And so what we are going to see with Carney in office, should he get a prolonged term in office, is essentially the implementation of a different version of Stéphane Dion's green shift.
Okay, so that's a very helpful outline, Marco. It's interesting, many good comments here. Robert Kerr says Carney is a total climate and financial hypocrite, according to Robert. So good insight. Susan says Carney was the economic advisor to Trudeau, the current prime minister, for the past 4 to 5 years. Liz Truss, the former UK prime minister, has warned Canada about Carney after his tenure as Bank of England governor. He was far worse than Trudeau. So very interesting comments and opinions here. Scott, would you have any observations about Mr. Carney in terms of his insight on the issues that the United States is talking about, including security issues? I'm just curious.
Well, I'm going to add to what Mark was talking about a little bit. There's a quote regarding decarbonization and Carney's net zero economy interests, and it goes like this: "The firms that anticipate these developments will be rewarded handsomely. Those that don't will cease to exist." I think that's pretty straightforward. But what he's doing is he's trying to get this Green Deal and measuring it against China's new Silk Road. And he's saying that if we don't do this, then the Silk Road is going to take over. Carney co-founded GFAN.
And pardon me, just to clarify, what is the Silk Road Initiative, Scott, for our audience?
Belt and Road Initiative is China's idea of a new trade system. It includes a seaborne, a land, and air as well. But one of it goes through the Arctic. Some of it goes through some countries in Europe. And it's going to try to replace the Western control we have over the 5 global choke points, which is where about 85% of trade occurs. So they believe that that's how they're going to establish this. That's what you're seeing in the South China Sea. That's why the Chinese are so aggressive there. But what I want
just to be clear, because what you're saying is just packed with significant strategic significance.
Sure.
The 5 choke points, meaning the choke points, pardon me, between continents, including at the Arctic, right? Is that right, Scott?
Yes. So you're including the Panama Canal, Suez Canal, and all those
exactly.
types. The Malacca Straits, which is the big South China Sea one. But Carney was the co-founder of GFANS, and I'm sure Marco's aware of this already, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. What people may not know is that he's the co-chair also, and that is connected to the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is challenging the United States to try to change what the dominant currency in the world is. That's a really big thing. On this board are 2 Chinese CCP officials. So there are connections related to what's going on in Mr. Carney's business life. I'm not going to elaborate any further than that. I'm sure people will be able to go and look up some of this information themselves. And I'll bet you will see information starting to come out about all of these connections in the next short while. And that will be conducted by concerned citizens, but also the United States government as they decide to release information as well through information operations to try to inform people about what's actually going on.
Yeah. So that's brilliant, Scott, because what we're doing is we are showing the level summary of facts, and there's many other layers of information that we can go into that relate to the strategic significance of, again, not only the economic financial reset that's going on with the United States and the restructuring, but also the geopolitical reset that has to happen for this hemisphere and for the world. So this is a big agenda that in Canada we have, well, would you say in the mainstream media, almost no hot clue about? Is that a fair comment, Marco and Scott?
I think so. You know, people have not heard about many of these sort of larger beliefs that Mr. Carney holds, and that's for a reason. You know, the book is available just about anywhere, including on the internet for anybody who wants to read it. But and I assume that many of the people in our mainstream media are acquainted with the plan and with the argument. They're just not talking about it, quite frankly. And so it is within their interests, I suppose, to some extent, that larger picture of Mr. Carney's ideology remains hidden, because the last time a liberal leader put those ideas at the forefront, he got destroyed. And so they want to be able to sort of usher in a new liberal era, with Mark Carney taking advantage of this invented crisis with the United States. And perhaps, I'm pretty sure that he's not going to shun these ideas because he's in office. The whole point of this book is almost a how-to argument for how to transform the economy, and how to get rid of a market capitalist economy and direct it towards a socialized economy in the service of the green agenda.
Exactly. So let's be frank here. We are all about trying to put Canada first and building up this incredible country. But what we have now is someone who represents a series of policies on the record, in the public, but also behind the scenes that align with something else. Okay? Whether it's net zero that will decimate our economy, that will decimate not only the oil and gas industry in Canada, but will cascade through our economy, whether it's manufacturing, forestry, mining, just to name a few, right? This is where the arrows point, correct?
Yeah, if you don't want to read the whole book, just read the introduction. You know, he makes it a point to say that we should never be satisfied with what we have achieved as a progressive sort of culture. And so basically, that signals a kind of a Maoist streak of a permanent revolution.
Indeed.
That no matter where you get, there is still always more to do.
Exactly.
It's pretty radical.
So this is, it really is pretty radical. So this is, I hope, a revelation or helpful to our audience. I just am so grateful for the conversation here. And I know we're a little bit beyond our normal time here, but I did want to finish off with another very intriguing question. And that relates to the contrast between Canada and Mexico. It was interesting. Last week I was within the great country of Mexico, and I heard a profound speech by the president of Mexico, and I thought it was a historic speech, quite frankly, where she talked in a visionary term about working collaboratively with the United States as their greatest ally. By the way, Mexico is now the largest trading partner of the United States. It's no longer Canada. Her speech was thoroughly focused on the national traditions of their country, along with the national traditions of the United States. it was thoroughly anti-globalist, if you can say that. And she threw down the gauntlet against the criminal cartels of Mexico. This was a historic speech. And she accepted the assistance from the United States to go after those cartels. I thought it was astounding as Mexico last week discovered another series of mass graves of hundreds of people. I mean, this war with the cartels is horrendous, and it's affected almost arguably every aspect of society. But what I found fascinating was this is in contrast with Carney's speech, which articulates a war, an economic war of sorts with Canada. His next trip, next week, official trip, will be to Europe. It won't be to the United States. Um, and so I'm wondering, is there any significance to that? Is Mexico carving out a different pathway in contrast to Canada? Who wants to take that one on first? Marco?
Sure, I'll jump in. Um, Look, going back to the analogy of the condominium, um, Mexico is still part of North America. We don't always think that way, but continentally, it is. And um, while Canada has is wanting to declare basically economic war against the United States, it has done almost the exact opposite of preparing for an economic war. Why? Because in
Indeed.
the last 10 years, we have done nothing but weakening our economy. It reminds me of the mullahs in Iran when they took over in February of '79. The first thing that they did is they rounded up all the generals and they shot them because they were loyal to the Shah. And then, of course, they got into a war with the next door neighbor. So imagine the equivalent of that is that we have essentially ransacked our own economy, and now we want to pick a fight, an economic fight, with the most robust economy on the planet. Let me just give you a couple of examples because we could talk about this for days. In terms of foreign investment, Canada's foreign investment situation is pathetic. It is in deep trouble. And in the last 10 years, while the Canada's foreign direct investment has dropped consistently for the last 10 years by basically it by about 9%. Mexico's has increased by 15%. So Mexico has been reaping the benefits of shoring up and making its economy more robust. In terms of labor productivity, where Canada is also in an abysmal state, Canada has dropped to nearly 2% in its productivity, in its labor productivity. And Mexico's productivity is also 15%. So think about the gap that means in terms of why? Because in Mexico, all throughout this last decade, they have been buying new machinery, they have been upping their infrastructure in ports, in transportation, in all kinds of key levels issue, including, by the way, also increasing their own security in spite of what is happening in the northern border. The capabilities of the Mexican fighting force have not been decimated by DEI and transsexual soldiers and people not allowed to pray and all these things that while the Mexicans have been shoring up and making their economy more robust, we have been essentially worried about, tampons in the male bathrooms and all this identity politics and all this nonsense.
Wow. What do you think, Scott? What's your comment here?
Well, I think people are learning that in Canada there's corruption. And unfortunately, no one wanted to believe that on such a scale that we're experiencing. So it's been kind of hidden. In Mexico, corruption is right out in the open. You can go on any Facebook group right now and look at trying to drive to Mexico, and it'll tell you don't drive at night, carry some cash, have a second wallet. And this is for anyone crossing the border and heading down south. So there's definitely concerns about what goes on in Mexico. I agree with you. Yes, they've been increasing their economic standing, but I'd also say you should look at how many ports are owned by China in Mexico, and the agreements between the Sinaloa cartel and what moves between the two countries. Sinaloa has a headquarters in Hong Kong. There is direct connection between the Chinese and Mexican cartels. If you look at the voting for the last election in Mexico, and we take a look at how many people that were trying to be elected were murdered, I would say that that would be concerning. There are over 120 cartels in Mexico. We hear about a couple of them. People in Canada have no idea what the scope and depth is of the cartels in Mexico and their connections to politicians and everything else. I would agree with you that I think they're taking the right stance in trying to work with the Americans. I think there is a will there, but don't think for an instant that the cartels are going to allow their business to be, uprooted over some
Yeah,
minor things here. And don't get me wrong, there's entities that are connected to this in the United States as well. But you're looking at, the recent report said that the Mexican cartels control the ELN in Colombia. So that's a pretty big thing, very bold statement. So the connectivity between what happens in South America, which includes Iranian and Chinese activity, the tunnels that you see being built in Mexico are mainly because of their connection with Hezbollah, where they learned to tunnel in Gaza. So there is a lot going on in Mexico, and I would say that I think that the steps they're taking, while they're greater than Canada, still aren't at the level that the United States wants to see. There was a report just the other day that the Americans were flying a plane, listening to comms over top of the former president of Mexico's house. There's a lot going on. We don't get to see it all. It's some of the stuff is classified, and the true nature of whatever this strategy is by the Americans, I'm saying it's the consolidation of power, and they want to protect the continent of North America because of the trajectory towards kinetic war with China. But yeah, I would agree that they're definitely moving ahead of Canada in many ways. Their Navy is bigger than our Navy, and they're not even a force projecting country. So yeah, Canada is behind in every way in this relationship, and I don't think that playing pokey chess with the most powerful nation on the face of the earth in the history of the world is the right way to go about trying to figure out what's best for Canadians.
yeah.
Okay, so just sorry, Marco.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to correct something because I think I tripped over my numbers on foreign investment. Canada's foreign investment has dropped 15%, and Mexico's has increased by 9%.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, and I think consistently the message here has been, given these kinds of challenges where the United States is resetting, restructuring itself for both financial, economic, and geopolitical reasons, we need to understand that reset. And therein lies the opportunity to renew and rebuild our own country that, best serves Canadians. And surely that's through working collaboratively with the United States while being very clear where there will be times where we disagree with the United States and we need to pursue our own interests vigorously. So, in this context, there has been, we've certainly had a far reaching conversation today with Scott McGregor and Marco Navarro-Genie, and I've certainly much appreciated the comments coming in from our audience. And I just wanted to note that there was a question from Jacqueline who asked, I would like to hear the guests speak about Freeland's comment about aligning with the EU for their nukes, of all things. These are nuclear weapons. And I think these are, frankly, absurd comments. And of course, we want to pursue diversification and trade with everybody. But who wants to quick tackle that one? Marco, do you want to respond briefly to that one?
Scott, go ahead.
It's almost humorous, to be honest with you, considering the fact that Canada is the reason that Pakistan has nuclear weapons, which were proliferated to North Korea, and yet Canada itself is a non-nuclear country. We could do this ourselves anytime we wanted to. There's just been no desire to do that. Going to the EU, asking them for help to defend us, it doesn't really add up. The United States has been doing this job for us. They've offered us everything, and we've turned it down. Basically saying that we don't want that type of weaponry on our soil. Well, now suddenly someone in Ottawa thinks that might be a good idea. I think it's a lot of knee-jerk reactions to try to get people to side with them. I don't see anything coming of it. The Europeans are not happy with what's going on in North America. Even though we're a Commonwealth country, our relationship with the UK is quite limited. As a UK passport holder, the differences are pretty big. We're a lot closer to the Americans than people think, and I don't think the UK has had the influence in Canada in terms of assisting us as most people think. For God's sakes, the 3 subs that they gave us, upholder class submarines, were things they were going to mothball. They were throwing them out, and this was for war reparations. That's what they're giving it to us, and we had to rebuild them. And they're used for training. They're not an effective tool, unlike what the Australians did, where they built the Collins class submarines, etc. So there's just a lot of examples where Canada gets kicked around, and we play the role. There's no reason we should be in the economic situation we are. We have all the natural resources. We have all of the intelligent people in this country that should be making us a lot of money. Heck, I was stationed in Bahrain for a year, and Bahrain's a tiny little country in the Middle East. Their only real export is oil, and they do pretty darn good. They're pretty wealthy. Anybody in the GCC region there is pretty wealthy, and they don't have the agriculture. They don't have the trees. They don't have they've got some oil. We have the 3rd largest oil reserve in the world, and we can't find housing for people. Our groceries cost too much. These things should not even be considerations for a country like Canada. So, yeah, the European Union helping us, or pardon me, the EU. I don't really see it being beneficial, other than causing a further divide with the United States, which isn't beneficial to Canadians.
All right. Well, as we wrap things up, I did want to just thank everybody for involved with this far-reaching conversation. It strikes me that it sounds like we really need a lot of critical thinking here when it comes to the issues. It's kind of confusing at times how we pursue the national interest. And I guess I'll just wrap this up by asking you, Marco, as we have a situation in our country which is certainly historic and many would call even a crisis of sorts. Why is it that our parliament is prorogued? Why is the parliament on hiatus? You think that we would be back at work debating these issues publicly, coming to grips with them, acting on things, implementing the basics of public policy to get our country strong, like, for example, implementing free trade in this nation, building pipelines, getting people back to work as much as possible. Why is it that our parliament has been prorogued, Marco?
The longer version of the answer is that we have a very weak political culture. Our country is based on a set of unwritten rules by and large, and the only police to these rules are vigilant citizens. And so, for as long as we are hands off and we pretend that everything is fine, we're willing to accept official narratives, especially now, knowing that governments lie and they lie to us in industrial quantities. We should pay more attention. And quite frankly, if we're not outraged, is a clear sign that we're not paying attention, because what is happening is beyond the pale. And so, yes, governments have that particular tool in their arsenal about proroguing, but it's certainly being abused. It does not meet the test that has been said many times. We prorogue Parliament to cover the back of the ruling party in a government that was falling apart. And so this tool has not been used for the good of the country. It is being used to protect the Liberal Party of Canada. In the middle of a crisis, that sin is 10 times as bad because there should be a parliament functioning right now. They should be sitting. Many of these issues that we are talking about here, not that I mean to say that we are supplanting parliament, nothing anywhere near, but we should be talking about them, but they should also be debated on the floor of the House of Commons. Canadians should demand nothing less than that.
Marco, I have a question for you, really quick, if it's okay. Why doesn't the person like second in command to the prime minister just take over if they want to resign? I'm thinking of the United States with the Biden administration and Kamala stepping up, something along that lines. Why would they not be able to do that, instead have this special election in the Liberal Party? I mean, there's a lot of information around that as well, with votes that were disqualified, etc. But why wouldn't it just be the next person in line that takes over, so we can just carry on? Like you said, we're in this crisis, and that's what they decide to do.
Constitutionally, we do not have anything like a vice president. We do have a deputy prime minister. In this case, it so happened that the deputy prime minister had gone to war against the sitting guy, and so the last thing that the sitting guy wanted was to cede the chair to her. But we do have constitutional tools, and the constitutional tools are exercised by the governor general. And I am not very happy to criticize the representative of the Crown, but in our case and in the last three iterations, we have had appalling choices as governors general. The governor general should never have accepted the desire of the government to prorogue. There was no reason to prorogue. If the ruling party was losing its head, and therefore the prime minister, the governor general should have insisted that if there was a political issue with the sitting prime minister, that then he should step down, and then the party should have named a different one. But what this also shows and betrays is an enormous weakness inside the caucus of the Liberal Party of Canada, which is still in charge, by the way. These are going to be the people that are going to be sitting around the cabinet table that Mr. Carney is about to form. So the political culture issue also applies to sitting parliamentarians, and they have essentially relinquished their authority to represent the people of this country, and they have been allowed themselves to be intimidated by the power of the exiting prime minister.
Is the governor general appointed or elected?
The governor general is named by the sitting prime minister and appointed by the Crown.
Good
So
to know.
within that system, this has
But-
been a within that system, though, there's an element of customary honor that is assumed in terms of how you use these practices of proroguing. You can't
Yes.
just prorogue the parliament for expedient political purposes. But
And the
anyways,
appointments
therein
that we
lies
have,
the
the
problem.
appointments that we have had have been total DEI appointments, right? And therein lies a significant part of the problem. The previous governor general, who tarnished himself in different ways, a prime minister, not prime minister, excuse me, the governor general. His name just popped out of my mind. David Johnson. He was one of the best governor generals we had had. And one of the reasons I ventured to I propose is that he was selected by an impartial committee that Prime Minister Harper put together. Right.
Indeed.
So he was indeed selected by the Prime Minister, but not out of the blue. He was basically vetted by a committee from a long list of people, and they tested him for his knowledge of the traditions and all the things that governors general are supposed to know before they actually put him in place. And he happened to have been a white guy, but he was not just well deserving, but very capable of occupying the position. One cannot say anything near or close to that about his successors.
We need to wrap up our conversation here. I want to thank both Scott and Marco for being our special guests today as we talked not only about the new prime minister to be sworn in tomorrow, but also the context in which he enters that office. And I think we've also had a tremendous conversation with our audience, and I want to thank all of you for caring enough to take the time to participate in this conversation. It's been a far-reaching conversation, and it will continue to unfold. And if there's one thing I've learned is that this is a situation that is both a challenge to our country, but surely it is an opportunity to renew it, to rebuild it. And that depends not only on our elected officials, who we need to demand more of, as Marco said, but we need to demand more of ourselves. So please continue to speak up and be involved in our country, because we know that we all love it because it's our home. So thank you again. Thank you, Jennifer, for your kind comment. Thanks for the interesting conversation. And Suzanne says thank you to all. Great conversation and very informative. So on that note, I invite you to join our conversation next Thursday, and be sure to subscribe to our newsletter, and be sure to check out our website where you can learn about many other related topics, including our upcoming Alaska cruise tour with our special guests, one of the co-founders of Greenpeace, Dr. Patrick Moore. And be sure to check that out. That happens in August, and that's actually a picture of the boat that we will be on. It will be a fantastic one-week cruise on a Princess cruise ship, and there'll be numerous opportunities for discussion and great hospitality among similar conversations with all kinds of people that care about this country. So please join us. So thanks again, everyone. And we'll meet you again next week on the same time and same place.
Thank you for watching Leaders on the